"If you dance this waltz, I will spare your life," the mafia boss said to the maid in front of 300 of the most powerful guests in America. Cruel laughter echoed through the grand hall. But when she took her first step, the silence that followed satisfied the souls of those who had been humiliated. The Blackwell mansion in Manhattan glittered as if the stars themselves had descended from the heavens to rest upon each baccarat crystal chandelier. 300 guests, dressed in elegance that only old money and blood money could buy, raised glasses of 100-year-old wine, while their laughter reverberated against the vaulted ceilings. This was the 36th birthday celebration of Cassian Blackwell, the man they called the Reaper of the East Coast, the ruler of a criminal empire that stretched across 15 states. His face bore a scar running from his temple to his cheekbone, a reminder that even kings bleed. His eyes, gray as a winter storm, had witnessed more death than most soldiers, and tonight they were fixed on her. But amidst all that glittering darkness, there was someone who did not belong to this world. Emilia Santos moved between the guests with a silver tray, serving canapés with precise and silent movements. She had learned long ago that the best way to survive in this house was to become invisible, never meet anyone's eyes, never speak unless spoken to, never exist beyond her function. The scars on her back, hidden beneath her worn uniform, told stories she had never shared with anyone. She had been working in this mansion since she was 18, ever since the debt collectors sold her to pay a loan she had never taken. Before that, there had been 3 years in the trafficking ring, after her parents were murdered before her eyes when she was only 7. Her grandmother, Helena, had rescued her, taught her to dance, gave her a reason to live. But Helena died when Emilia was 16, and the world had shown no mercy since. No family, no money, no choices. 9 years she had served the Blackwells. 9 years of silence and survival, never knowing that the man who owned her was the grandson of the man who destroyed everything she loved. If this story satisfies your soul, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter, because in the next part, the waltz begins, and nothing will ever be the same. That night, there was a fateful instant Emilia never saw coming. As she passed through the center of the grand hall, her gaze caught, by accident, on a massive oil painting hanging behind where Cassian stood. The painting showed a woman dancing, black hair streaming in the wind, her feet as if they were gliding over clouds. Emilia's heart seemed to stop. It was the very same painting Helena had once hung in their small home. The painting, Helena said, was the portrait of an old friend who had died long ago. Emilia couldn't understand why it was here, inside the enemy's mansion. Only a few seconds. Emilia looked for only a few seconds, then lowered her head and kept walking. But those few seconds were enough. Victoria Blackwell had seen everything. Cassian's sister stood not far away, a glass of blood-red wine in her hand, her lips curving into a vicious smile. Victoria had hated Emilia from the first day she set foot in this mansion. She hated how Emilia endured every cruelty in silence and never cried. She hated how the scars on Emilia's back, scars Victoria herself had made, never once made the maid beg. And more than anything, she hated the way Emilia looked. Those dark brown eyes always holding a flame Victoria couldn't smother, no matter how hard she'd tried for 9 years. Victoria slipped through the crowd like a venomous snake and came up beside Cassian. She leaned in and whispered into her brother's ear with a voice full of delight. "Do you know what our little maid just did? She dared to look straight at you. Not just look, she stared as if you were something that belonged to her." Cassian was in a foul mood. Only hours earlier, he'd received word that there was a traitor in the organization. Someone who'd sold information to a rival on the West Coast. 12 of his men had died because that information had leaked. 12 lives. And now a maid dared to lift her face and look at him. "Which maid?" Cassian asked, his voice cold as ice. "The Santos girl." Victoria pointed toward Emilia, standing near a marble column, head bowed low, trying to disappear into the shadows. She even told the other maids her grandmother used to dance better than anyone in the Blackwell family. Can you imagine that? A maid daring to compare her ragged family to us. Cassian's gray eyes shifted, cutting through the crowd until they landed on Emilia. She didn't look up, but she felt that stare, as if someone had set a cold blade against the back of her neck. Her whole body trembled, yet she didn't dare move. Cassian tilted his head, studying that small maid with a curiosity threaded with cruelty. For 9 years she'd worked in this house, and he'd never truly looked at her. She'd been nothing but a shadow, a tool, an object that could move. But tonight, he wanted entertainment. He wanted to see fear in someone's eyes. He wanted to remind everyone in this room that Cassian Blackwell wasn't someone to be played with. Fine. Cassian set his whiskey down, a cold smile blooming on his lips. Bring her here. I've got a little game for my guests. Victoria lit up, as if she'd just been handed the greatest birthday present of her life. She signaled to 2 guards, and they started toward Amelia. Amelia's heart hammered as she saw them coming closer. She knew something terrible was about to happen. She could feel it in every strand of flesh, every bone in her body, but she didn't run. Where could she run when this whole world was her prison? 2 guards seized Amelia by the arms, and the silver tray slipped from her hands and crashed onto the marble floor with a shrill clatter. The canapes tumbled and rolled beneath the guests' feet, but no one looked down. Every pair of eyes fixed on the small maid being dragged away like a criminal. Amelia didn't fight. She'd learned long ago that resisting only made everything worse. The scars across her back were proof of that lesson, but her heart was racing out of control, and she felt as though she was being led to an execution. When they neared the stage where the orchestra was playing, Cassian lifted a hand and signaled for the music to stop. The sudden silence dropped over the hall like a heavy blanket, suffocating and absolute. 300 guests turned their heads, curious and eager, like vultures catching the scent of blood. Ladies and gentlemen, Cassian's voice rang out, low and cold, slicing through the air like a blade. I apologize for interrupting the party, but I've got a little entertainment for you tonight. A few giggles flitted here and there. They knew when Cassian Blackwell spoke of entertainment, it usually meant someone was about to endure something awful, and they couldn't wait to watch. Amelia was shoved up the steps leading to the stage. She nearly fell, but she forced herself to steady her feet. She wouldn't let them see weakness. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Cassian stepped in front of her, nearly a head taller, his shadow swallowing her like the darkness of death itself. This is Amelia Santos, he announced, his voice dripping with contempt. A maid in the Blackwell household for 9 years. She cleans our rooms, washes our clothes, serves our food. Each word struck like a knife, carving at what little dignity Amelia had left. Yet she stood still, eyes lowered to the floor, letting nothing show on her face. Cassian tilted his head, studying her with a cruel kind of curiosity. My sister just told me something very interesting, he went on. This little maid claims her grandmother was once a dancer, and she even dared to say the woman danced better than anyone in the Blackwell family. Laughter erupted across the hall. Amelia felt heat rush to her cheeks, but she clamped her lips shut and said nothing. She hadn't said those words. She'd only spoken to Maria, the only maid who'd ever been kind to her, about Helena. But Victoria had heard and twisted everything. Did you hear that? Cassian turned to the crowd, his voice swelling with theatrical outrage, a maid daring to compare her ragged family to the Blackwell bloodline. My grandfather danced with European queens. My father was one of the finest waltz dancers of his generation. And she, he pointed at Amelia, dares to think her grandmother, a kitchen cook, could stand beside them. Victoria's laughter chimed from below, her face bright with malice. The other guests laughed too, the sound echoing like crows calling over carrion. Amelia felt tears rise, hot and urgent, but she swallowed them down. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't ever cry in front of them. So, Cassian said, and his voice turned suddenly sweet in a way that made the skin crawl. I have a small proposal. A game, if you'd like to call it that. He drew a sleek black pistol from inside his vest. The crystal lights caught on the metal, glittering like dead stars. The entire hall went silent. Cassian set the gun on a small table beside the stage, gently, as if he were laying down a flower. If you can dance this waltz, he said, his eyes locked on Amelia's. If you can dance like a real dancer, I'll spare your life. Amelia lifted her head, for the first time looking straight into his eyes. And if I can't? She asked, her voice trembling but never weak. Cassian smiled, the smile of a predator that had finally driven its prey into a corner. If you fail, if you stumble, if you prove you're nothing but a maid who knows only how to scrub floors. He picked the pistol up again and turned it slowly in his hand. I'll end your meaningless life myself, right here on this stage. A horrified whisper spread through the hall. But no one spoke up to stop it. No one dared. This was Cassian Blackwell's law. This was his world. And in his world, a human life was cheaper than a glass of wine. Silence. Amelia stood in the middle of the stage, feeling the eyes of 300 people pierce through her like 300 needles. The gun lay on the table, glossy black and lethal. Waiting, she could hear her own heartbeat. one beat after another, like a death drum. This was the moment she should have dropped to her knees and begged. This was the moment she should have sobbed and pleaded the way so many others had in front of Cassian Blackwell. But instead, in that instant that felt endless, Amelia's mind drifted somewhere else. She remembered the tiny room in the slums, where Helena taught her her first dance steps. She remembered Helena's hands, thin but warm, holding her hands and guiding her as she turned in circles on an old wooden floor that creaked and groaned. She remembered Helena's voice, low and full of love. Dancing doesn't live in your feet, my girl. It lives in your soul, and your soul, the soul of the Valdez bloodline, is stronger than any storm, brighter than any star. Don't ever let anyone extinguish that flame. The flame. Amelia felt it flare inside her chest. Small but stubborn. The kind of fire 9 years of slavery couldn't put out. The kind of fire the scars on her back couldn't burn away. Helena had pulled her out of hell. Helena had taught her that no matter how cruel life became, she still had the right to hold her head high. And now, standing before death, Amelia suddenly understood something. If she died tonight, she wanted to die as a free woman, not as a slave on her knees. She wanted to die with her chin lifted, with the flame still burning, with Helena's dance running through her veins. Amelia drew a deep breath. Then she did what no one in that room expected. She raised her head and looked straight into Cassian Blackwell's eyes. Not with a pleading gaze, not with fear, but with the look of someone who had accepted fate and still refused to bow. Cassian's gray eyes widened slightly. In a single heartbeat, he saw something in the dark brown eyes of his maid, something he couldn't name. It wasn't empty defiance. It was deeper, stronger, as if an entire ocean was hidden behind those eyes. I accept. Amelia's voice carried, soft but steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. A stunned whisper rippled through the hall. Victoria's mouth fell open. Even the guards exchanged surprised looks. No one thought she'd accept. They thought she'd fall to her knees, sob, beg, and Cassian would grant her a quick death as a kind of mercy. But Amelia wasn't finished. I accept, she repeated, clearer now, but I have a condition. A condition? Cassian lifted an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement touching his cold face. Who do you think you are to set conditions with me? Amelia didn't flinch. If I can dance this waltz, if I can prove the blood in my veins isn't as ordinary as you think, you won't just spare my life. She paused and drew another breath. You'll set me free. Completely free. Victoria barked out a laugh. She's insane. This maid is insane. But Cassian didn't laugh. He watched Amelia, head slightly tilted, as if he were staring at a strange creature he'd never seen before. 9 years she'd lived in this house, and this was the first time he was truly seeing her. Fine, Cassian said, slow and measured. If you surprise me, you'll be free. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell whiskey and expensive tobacco on his breath. But I'm warning you, he whispered, low enough that only she could hear. I'm not easily surprised. Amelia didn't step back. She held his storm-colored gaze and answered, her voice no more than a breath. You will be... Cassian stepped back and signaled to the orchestra. Maestro Julian Crane, who'd sat in silence at the grand piano all evening, suddenly lifted his head. His aged eyes settled on Amelia's face, and something like a strange flash crossed his gaze, as if he'd just seen the ghost of the past. But no one noticed his reaction. Every eye was fixed on the maid standing in the center of the stage. Amelia bent down and slowly slipped off the old black shoes she'd worn for 9 years. They were worn and frayed, their soles rubbed thin, carrying the traces of thousands of quiet steps through cold hallways. She set them aside, gently, as if she were laying down the weight of a lifetime of humiliation. Then she straightened, barefoot on the icy marble floor. A few giggles rose from below. Look at her. She's going to dance barefoot, Victoria said loudly, her voice dripping with ridicule. Typical maid. She can't even afford shoes. But Amelia didn't hear her. She'd closed the door of her mind, sealing herself away from the cruelty around her. In that instant, she wasn't in the Blackwell mansion anymore. She was standing in Helena's small room, with late afternoon sunlight spilling through the window and the faint scent of jasmine riding the breeze. She could hear Helena's voice, soft and warm. Feel the floor beneath your feet, Helena. Let it become part of you. Don't dance on the floor. Dance with it. Amelia closed her eyes. She felt the marble beneath her soles, cold but steady. She felt the air around her, heavy with expectation and malice. She felt her own heartbeat, slowly settling, steady as a distant drum. Maestro Julian placed trembling fingers on the keys. He'd intended to play a simple waltz, something a maid could never keep up with. But when he looked at Amelia, when he saw the way she stood, the way she breathed, the way she tilted her head as if she were listening to a melody no one else could hear, a memory surged up without warning. He remembered another woman, many years ago, who'd stood the same way, breathed the same way, carried that same gaze, Helena Valdez. Maestro Julian's old heart tightened. It couldn't be a coincidence. Yet his hands moved on their own, and instead of the simple waltz, he began to play a different melody, one he hadn't played in 30 years. The melody his son, Raphael, had composed for the woman he loved. The first notes rose, clear and aching, like the weeping of lost souls. Amelia opened her eyes. She knew this melody. Helena had sung it to her every night before sleep. Helena said it was the song a man had written for her, the man she loved but could never be with. And now that melody was sounding inside the enemy's mansion. As if fate itself were opening a door Amelia hadn't known existed. She began to move. The first step was light as breath, as if she were testing whether the floor could bear the weight of her soul. The second step was surer, a small turn, her arms lifting as though she were holding an invisible partner. The third step, and Amelia was no longer Amelia. She was Helena. She was Rosa. She was every woman in the Valdez line, women who had loved and lost and wept and risen again. She was a flame that would never die. The melody swelled, and Amelia rose with it. Her bare feet skimmed across the marble as if they were gliding over clouds. Her black hair came loose, flying with each turn. The frayed maid's uniform suddenly didn't matter, because everyone could see that the person dancing on that stage wasn't a maid. It was a queen. It was fire. It was a storm. The waltz poured from Amelia like water from a spring, natural and impossible to stop. Every step told a story. Every turn carried a memory. Every tilt of her head held an entire lifetime of sorrow. She wasn't dancing to prove anything to Cassian Blackwell or to the 300 guests staring at her with open mouths. She was dancing for Helena, for her mother Rosa, for her father Miguel, for everyone who'd loved her and had been stolen from her arms. The melody shifted into its climax, and Amelia spun like a whirlwind. The skirt of her worn maid's uniform flared around her, no longer a symbol of submission, but becoming wings. In that moment, under the glittering crystal lights, she wasn't the maid being humiliated. She was a fallen angel rising out of hell. And then, in the middle of that turning, Amelia felt something strange. She wasn't dancing alone anymore. An invisible hand seemed to close around hers, guiding her, steadying her, lifting her. A familiar warmth wrapped around her, the scent of jasmine and freshly baked bread, the smell of the small home where she'd once been happy. Helena. Amelia didn't know if it was a hallucination or a miracle, but she could feel Helena here, right beside her, dancing with her like in the old days. She heard Helena's voice whisper at her ear, gentle and proud. "Beautiful, my girl. Let your soul lead. Don't think. Don't be afraid. Just feel." Tears streamed down Amelia's cheeks, but she didn't stop. Those tears flowed into the dance, becoming part of the story she was telling. She danced through the pain of losing her parents at 7 years old, through 3 years of hell in the hands of traffickers, through Helena's death, through 9 years of slavery inside this very house. Every step was a scar. Every turn was another fall and another rise. Every lifted arm was a reach toward light in endless darkness. Maestro Julian Crane played as if he were bewitched, his old fingers flying over the keys as though some supernatural force were guiding them. Tears ran down his wrinkled face, but he didn't wipe them away. He knew now. That silhouette, that way of moving, that tilt of the head. This couldn't be coincidence. This girl had to be connected to Helena Valdez, the woman his son had loved until his final breath. The waltz slipped into its most sorrowful passage, where the melody sounded like the crying of broken hearts. Amelia slowed, her movements turning softer, as if she were gathering her pain into her arms instead of running from it. She arched backward, face lifted toward the ceiling, eyes tightly closed, as if surrendering herself to some unseen power. In that posture, the fabric at her back slipped down, revealing the scars across her skin. Scars layered over scars, old and new, the marks of whips, the marks of punishment for mistakes she'd never made. 300 guests saw those scars, and for the first time that night, some of them felt something other than pleasure. They felt shame. They felt horror. They understood that this girl wasn't just a maid. She was a survivor. She was a warrior. Amelia turned one last time, fierce and powerful as a storm before it breaks apart. The melody surged to its peak, the notes rising high like the scream of a soul finally set free. And then, abruptly, everything stopped. Amelia stood at the center of the stage, her chest rising and falling, sweat shimmering on her skin like diamonds. Her dark brown eyes opened, and in those eyes there was no pain left, only peace, the quiet calm of someone who'd finally set down a burden carried for an entire lifetime. She was done dancing. She was done telling her story. And whatever happened next, whether Cassian Blackwell kept his promise or not, Amelia knew she'd won, not by defeating him, but by defeating the fear that had imprisoned her for so many years. In that absolute silence, before anyone could react, Amelia whispered a sentence only she and Helena's spirit could hear. "I did it, Grandma. I didn't let them extinguish the flame." 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. The silence stretched on as if time itself had stopped moving. 300 people stood frozen, no one daring to breathe too loudly, no one daring to shift, as if they'd all just witnessed a miracle and were afraid that any sound might shatter the dream. Then, somewhere in the crowd, a glass slipped and fell. The crack of shattered crystal against the marble rang out like a bell, waking the entire hall from its trance, and the reactions began. Victoria Blackwell was the first to break out of her paralysis. Her face, usually bright with malice and pleasure, had gone pale as a corpse. Her vivid red lips pressed so tightly they nearly disappeared, and the fingers gripping her wineglass clenched until her knuckles turned white. "It can't be," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "A maid can't dance like that. This is cheating. Someone must have taught her. Someone must have." But no one heard Victoria, because everyone was looking at Amelia, and everyone knew what they'd just witnessed wasn't the result of a few dance lessons. It was a gift. It was blood. It was something that couldn't be taught or learned, only something you were born carrying. In another corner of the grand hall, Margaret Blackwell was crying. She'd tried to hold it back, had bitten her lip until it bled, yet the tears still poured down, unstoppable. No one noticed her. Everyone was too focused on the stage. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen her trembling from head to toe. Margaret knew that dance. She'd seen it more than 30 years ago, when she was still a young woman newly brought into the Blackwell family. The one who danced it was Helena Valdez, the woman the entire city once called the Swan of the dance floor. The woman Edward Blackwell, her father-in-law, had ordered destroyed for a crime Margaret had never believed was real. Margaret looked at Amelia, at the way she stood, the way she breathed, the way she tilted her head, and she understood. This girl didn't just dance like Helena. This girl was Helena's blood, and if that was true, then everything the Blackwell family had done to her, every year they'd turned her into a slave, would become an unforgivable crime. But the strongest reaction didn't come from Victoria or Margaret. It came from Maestro Julian Crane. The old man still sat at the grand piano, his hands motionless on the keys, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. He'd known from the moment she began to dance. But now, with the waltz finished, the confirmation hit him like a fist. This girl was Helena's granddaughter, the granddaughter of the woman his son had loved until his final breath, the granddaughter of the woman the Blackwell family had destroyed. And that meant this girl also carried blood ties to Raphael, his son. Julian felt as if his old heart might burst. For years he'd searched. Years he'd tried to find any clue about the grandchild his son might have left in this world. And now the girl was standing right in front of him, alive, surviving hell after hell, made into a slave by the enemy's own family. He had to speak to her. He had to tell her the truth. But not now. Not in front of 300 watching eyes. In the crowd, applause began to rise. One person at first, then 2, then 10, then the entire hall. The guests weren't clapping because they wanted to praise a maid, but because they couldn't help it. Their bodies reacted before their minds could stop them. They just witnessed something extraordinary, and no matter how badly they wanted to deny it, they couldn't look away. Amelia stood in the storm of applause, but she didn't hear it. She looked only at Cassian Blackwell, the man still standing motionless beside the gun, his storm-gray eyes fixed on her with an expression she couldn't read. And in the moment their gazes locked, they both knew their lives would never be the same again. The applause slowly faded, giving way once again to a tense, waiting silence. Every gaze shifted now from Amelia to Cassian, awaiting the verdict of the Dark King. The gun still sat on the table, glossy and cold, but Cassian didn't look at it. He looked only at Amelia, his gray eyes never leaving her for even a second. Then he did what no one in the room expected. Cassian Blackwell, the East Coast Reaper, the man who'd never bowed his head to anyone, inclined forward in a slow, slight bow. It wasn't the bow of someone beneath another, but the bow of a gentleman before a lady, a silent acknowledgement that she had won. A stunned whisper rippled through the hall like ocean waves. Victoria nearly dropped her glass for the second time that night. Margaret lifted a hand to cover her mouth, not knowing whether to cry or laugh. Even the coldest guards exchanged disbelieving looks. No one had ever seen Cassian bow to a woman, not once. Amelia stood still, her chest still rising and falling from the dance, but her gaze didn't waver. She waited. She waited for him to speak. She waited for him to keep his promise. She waited for the freedom she'd paid for with her soul. Cassian straightened, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't as cold as before. There was something else in it, something even he didn't fully understand. "You surprised me," he said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "Not just surprised. You stunned me. I've lived 36 years in this world. I've seen a lot. I've endured a lot. But I've never witnessed anything like what you just did." Amelia's heart began to race again. This was the moment he'd let her go. This was the moment she'd be free. This was the moment 9 years of slavery would end. "So," Cassian continued, stepping closer, close enough for her to see every line in his face, close enough for her to feel his breath against her skin. "I'll keep my promise. You won't die tonight." Amelia let out a shaky breath, but the relief lasted only a heartbeat, because Cassian wasn't finished. "But I can't let you leave." The world under Amelia's feet seemed to collapse. She stared at him, unable to believe what she'd just heard. "You promised." Her voice trembled, but the steel stayed in it. "You said if I surprised you, you'd set me free." "I said if you surprised me," Cassian replied, a strange smile appearing on his mouth. Not cruel and not kind either. The smile of someone who'd just discovered something too precious to let go. "But you didn't surprise me, Amelia. You haunted me." Amelia took a step back, but Cassian followed. "And what haunts Cassian Blackwell," he said, his voice dropping into a whisper meant only for the two of them, "is never allowed to leave. Never." "I'm not your property," Amelia said, her voice like fire even as her heart sank into ice. "I'm a person. I have a right to be free." "A right?" Cassian tilted his head, his gray gaze sliding over her face as if he were trying to memorize every detail. "Do you know where you are? This is my world. This is my kingdom. In this kingdom, the only right that exists is mine." He turned to the crowd, his voice ringing out with authority. "From tonight onward, Amelia Santos is no longer a maid of the Blackwell household. She'll be treated as a special guest. She'll have her own room. She'll have servants attending her. But she isn't permitted to leave this mansion. That's my order." Victoria opened her mouth to protest, but Cassian's cold stare cut her off. Margaret closed her eyes, as if she couldn't bear it anymore. Amelia stood on the stage, feeling like she'd just escaped one cage only to step into another. A cage of gold instead of iron, but still a cage. She looked at Cassian, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes beyond cruelty. She saw loneliness. She saw longing. She saw an abandoned child hiding behind the mask of a king. But it didn't change the truth that he'd just betrayed her. And Amelia swore to herself, no matter how long it took, she'd find a way out of this place. She wouldn't let any cage, gold, or iron imprison her soul forever. Right after the party ended, 2 maids led Amelia through hallways she'd never been allowed to step into in all 9 years. The east wing of the mansion, reserved for the Blackwell family, and only the most important guests. Each of her footsteps echoed on the marble, and she felt as if she were walking into another world, a world so lavish it stole the breath from your lungs, yet so cold it reached straight into your bones. They stopped in front of a massive oak door, intricately carved. One of the maids opened it and bowed her head. "This is your room from now on," she said, her voice empty of feeling. "Mr. Blackwell ordered that everything you need be prepared." Amelia stepped inside and went still. The room was larger than the small house where she and Helena had once lived. A 4-poster bed draped in deep red velvet, sheets of pure white silk. A rosewood wardrobe took up an entire wall, and inside hung dresses Amelia knew were worth more than everything she'd ever owned in her life. A vanity with a gold-framed mirror, crystal perfume bottles sparkling, a wide window overlooking the rose garden, moonlight pouring in and laying a soft silver veil over everything. But Amelia didn't see beauty. She saw a cage. She went to the window and tried to open it. Locked. She crossed to the balcony doors. Locked. She turned back toward the main door that had just closed behind her and heard a key turning in the lock. Locked. Beautiful, isn't it? Victoria's voice came from somewhere in the shadows. Amelia spun around and saw her sitting in an armchair in the corner, legs crossed, a glass of red wine in her hand. She'd been there all along, waiting like a snake in its den. "My brother gave you the finest room in the East Wing," Victoria said as she rose and moved closer with a predator's grace. "Do you know who this room belonged to before you? This was my mother's room when she first came here as a bride." Amelia said nothing. She only stood still and looked straight into Victoria's eyes. She'd learned long ago that silence was the best weapon against someone like her. Victoria clenched her jaw, clearly irritated that she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted. "You think you won," she hissed, her beautiful face twisting with fury. "You think just because you can dance a few cheap steps, you can climb over this family's head and neck?" Victoria moved in closer, close enough for Amelia to smell the wine on her breath. "I don't know what trick you used to enchant my brother, but I swear to you, I'll find out. And when I do," she smiled, a smile cold as ice, "you'll wish you'd died on that stage tonight." Victoria turned on her heel and left, her high heels striking the floor like a countdown to the end of the world. The door slammed, and Amelia was alone again. She stood in the luxurious room, looking around at expensive things she didn't want. Silk dresses, French perfume, a soft bed. None of it meant anything when the door was locked from the outside. She walked to the wardrobe, opened it, and stared at the dresses hanging inside. Red, black, white, blue, every one of them tailored perfectly, as if someone already knew her measurements. It made her shiver. How long had Cassian been planning this? Or did he simply have the power to make anything real in a single breath? Amelia closed the wardrobe and went to the window. She looked out at the rose garden under the moonlight, and for the first time since the dance ended, she allowed herself to cry. Tears slid down her cheeks, fell onto the windowsill, and disappeared into the dark. She danced like she'd never danced before. She'd laid her entire soul onto that stage. She'd won, but her victory had only traded an iron cage for a golden one. She was still a prisoner, still Cassian Blackwell's possession, still without the right to decide her own life. "Grandma," she whispered into the darkness, "what am I supposed to do now?" But Helena didn't answer. There was only the sound of wind slipping through the window seam, cold and lonely. Amelia wiped her tears and lifted her head. She didn't know what to do, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't give up. She'd survived the hell of trafficking. She'd survived 9 years of slavery. She'd survive this too. And one day, she'd be free. No matter how long it took, no matter what it cost, she would be free. The first night, Amelia didn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring into the darkness and waiting for dawn. The second night, she didn't sleep either. But this time it wasn't fear or worry that kept her awake. It was because he came. Cassian appeared at midnight, when the entire mansion had sunk into silence. No knock at the door, no warning, only the sound of a key turning, and then his tall figure filled the doorway, moonlight laying a silver streak across the scar on his face. Amelia sprang up from the chair by the window, survival instinct forcing her to step back, but Cassian didn't come closer. He only stood there, leaning against the frame, gray eyes fixed on her in the dark. "Dance," he said, and it wasn't an order so much as it was almost a plea. Amelia stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. He'd locked her in this room, turned her into a prisoner, and now he wanted her to dance for him like some circus monkey. "No," she answered, her voice hard as steel. Cassian didn't get angry. He only tilted his head, as if her answer was exactly what he'd expected. "Then talk to me," he said. "About what?" Amelia shot back, not bothering to hide the challenge in her tone. "About your grandmother. About the one who taught you to dance like that." Amelia went silent for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice flat and cold. "Why should I tell you anything?" "Because I want to know," Cassian replied, as simply as if that were reason enough. "And because tonight I don't feel like killing anyone. I need something to keep me entertained." He said it like a joke, but Amelia knew it wasn't entirely a joke. This was Cassian Blackwell, a man who could kill someone over breakfast and still eat with an appetite. But that night, he didn't kill anyone. He didn't force Amelia to dance either. He only sat down in the chair across from her and waited. And somehow, maybe because her loneliness had been trapped inside her for too long, Maybe because she needed to speak the things she'd buried for years, Amelia began to tell him. She told him about Helena, about the small home in the slums, about afternoons learning to dance on an old wooden floor that creaked beneath her feet, about the smell of jasmine and toasted bread, about how Helena called her little flame and said that one day she'd burn the whole world. Cassian listened in silence, and when Amelia stopped, he asked a question that caught her off guard. "Did your grandmother ever mention a man named Raphael?" Amelia froze. Raphael. That name. Helena had mentioned it once, only once, in a fevered haze before she died. She'd said Raphael's name and cried, tears of someone who'd lost the most precious thing in the world. Amelia had never known who Raphael was. "How do you know that name?" she asked, her voice trembling. Cassian didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, gray eyes as if they were staring into a distant past. "My father used to mention the name Raphael," he said, his voice dropping lower. "He said Raphael was a pianist, the son of Maestro Julian Crane. He said Raphael died young, and that his death had something to do with my grandfather. But every time I asked for more, my father went quiet." A chill ran down Amelia's spine. Something was wrong here. There was an invisible thread binding her to the Blackwell family, a thread she couldn't yet see but could feel in her bones. "Your father," she said slowly. "What kind of man was he?" "Victor Blackwell." Cassian exhaled, and for the first time Amelia saw real exhaustion on his face. "He was the only person who ever loved me. He taught me that real strength doesn't live in killing. It lives in protecting the people you love. And he died when I was 15. 15. Amelia did the math in her head. Cassian was 36, which meant his father died 21 years ago. The same year Helena suddenly appeared and rescued her from the traffickers. The same year her life changed completely. Was that just coincidence? Or was something bigger hiding underneath it all? Cassian rose, preparing to leave. But before he stepped out, he paused and spoke without turning around. "I'll come back tomorrow night, and the nights after that, until I understand why you haunt me like this." The door closed, the lock clicked. Amelia stood alone in the darkness, her mind spinning with incomplete pieces. Helena, Raphael, Victor Blackwell, death, coincidence. She felt as if she were standing in front of a massive curtain, and behind it was a truth that could change everything. But she didn't know how to pull that curtain down. She didn't know whether she had the courage to face what was hiding behind it. And she didn't know that Maestro Julian Crane, at this very moment, was sitting in his room inside the Blackwell mansion, writing a letter that would change her life forever. 3 days after the night Cassian mentioned the name Raphael, Amelia received an unexpected visitor. Her door opened, and instead of Cassian or Victoria, Maestro Julian Crane stepped inside. He looked even more drawn than he had on the night of the party, his eyes hollow as if he hadn't slept in days. In his hands was a small wooden box, old and worn smooth by time. "May I speak with you?" he said, his voice trembling. "There are things you need to know, things I've kept silent about for far too long." Amelia looked at him, surprised and wary. She couldn't understand why a world-famous maestro would want to speak privately with her, a former maid being held captive, but there was something in his eyes, a deep pain threaded with a fragile hope, that made her nod. Julian sat in the chair across from her and set the wooden box on the table between them. His hands shook as he lifted the lid. Inside were photographs yellowed with age, brittle old letters, and a silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant. The moment Amelia saw the necklace, it was as if lightning struck her. She lifted a hand to her chest, where Helena's necklace still rested beneath the fabric of her dress. The necklace in the box was identical to hers, except one held a whole heart, and the other was only half. "You have the other necklace, don't you?" Julian asked, his voice thick with emotion. "The other half of this heart." Amelia didn't answer with words. She slowly drew the necklace from beneath her clothing and laid it in her palm. The half-silver heart glimmered in the morning light as if it had been waiting for this moment for years. Julian looked at it and began to cry. Not loud sobs, but the quiet tears of a man who'd carried grief for too long. "My son," he said, his voice like a whisper drifting from a distant grave. "Raphael gave this necklace to Helena on the day they married in secret. Each of them kept half the heart, promising they'd reunite when the time was right. But that time never came." Amelia felt the world around her tilt and spin. Helena and Raphael, married, but Helena had a daughter, her mother, Rosa, and Rosa was supposed to be the wife of Miguel Santos, her father. So what was the truth? Helena and Raphael loved each other from the time they were very young, Julian continued, his aged eyes staring into empty space as if he were watching the past unfold. Raphael was a gifted pianist, and Helena was a genius on the dance floor. They met at a performance, and from that moment, fate bound them together. They married in secret because the Blackwell family wouldn't accept the marriage. Edward Blackwell, Cassian's grandfather, forbade Raphael from going near Helena. Why? Amelia asked, her voice shaking. Because Helena was the daughter of Antonio Valdez, the true founder of the empire the Blackwell family now holds, Julian answered, and every word hit Amelia's understanding like a hammer. Edward didn't want anyone reminding the world of the Valdez family. He'd stolen everything from them, and he feared that if Raphael married Helena, the truth would be exposed. Amelia struggled to breathe. Helena, the woman who'd saved her, raised her, was the heir to an empire, and she, Amelia, was Helena's granddaughter. Then what does that mean, Rosa? My mother, Amelia asked, her voice on the edge of breaking. Was she Helena and Raphael's child? Julian nodded, tears still running. Rosa was their daughter, but when Edward discovered Helena was pregnant, he did everything he could to tear them apart. Raphael was forced to leave, and Helena was made to marry Miguel Santos, a man who worked for Edward, to hide the truth. Miguel knew Rosa wasn't his, but he loved Helena and accepted everything. He was a good man, until Edward stole his life too. Amelia sat perfectly still, feeling as if she'd been thrown into the center of a storm. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her family, had been a lie. Her father wasn't Miguel Santos. Her mother's father was Raphael Crane, the son of the man sitting in front of me. So you, she whispered, looking at Julian through tears. You're my great-grandfather. Julian rose, stepped closer, and knelt in front of her. His old hands closed around hers, trembling but warm. I never stopped looking for my son's grandchild. And now, finally, I've found you. Amelia couldn't hold it in anymore. She cried, the tears pouring out like a dam finally breaking after years of restraint. She wasn't alone in the world anymore. She had a family. She had roots. She had a great-grandfather. But inside that painful joy, one question still burned in her mind. If the Blackwell family stole everything from the Valdez family, if they killed Raphael, destroyed Helena's life, then what role did Cassian Blackwell, the man holding her captive, play in all of it? That same night, while Amelia was still drowning in the shock of Maestro Julian's revelations, Cassian Blackwell was standing in a hidden basement beneath the mansion. He'd found it entirely by accident while searching for clues about the traitor inside his organization. A false wall in his grandfather Edward's office, disguised so perfectly for decades, had opened onto a staircase leading down into darkness, and at the bottom of those steps was a small, damp room, with an old safe sitting in silence like an unexcavated tomb. Cassian stood in front of the safe, his hands trembling in a way that felt unnatural. He was the East Coast Reaper, a man whose hands never shook when he pulled a trigger, yet right now, he was shaking. Something in the wet, stale air of that cellar made him feel as if he were standing at the mouth of hell. The safe's combination was his father Victor's birth date. Cassian had tried every string of numbers he could think of, and in the end, it was the birthday of the only man Edward had ever loved that opened the lock. Inside was a metal box, and inside that box were documents yellowed with time. Cassian carried the box up to his office, closed the door, and began to read. Every page he turned was a knife driven into everything he'd ever believed. The first document was a handwritten will, Antonio Valdez's signature at the bottom, dated more than 50 years earlier. In that will, Antonio left his entire empire, including a network of businesses stretching across the east coast of the United States, to his only daughter, Helena Valdez. Cassian read the name again and again, feeling as if someone had thrown cold water in his face. Helena Valdez, the woman Amelia called her grandmother, the woman who'd taught Amelia to dance the waltz that haunted him. The second document was a letter, written in his grandfather Edward's own hand, a confession he'd never meant anyone to read. In it, Edward described how he'd risen, step by step, from an ordinary bodyguard into power. Antonio Valdez had trusted Edward like a son, had taught him everything about running the empire, had treated him as more than family, and Edward had repaid that trust by poisoning Antonio slowly over 3 years, making his death look like a natural illness. After Antonio died, Edward forged a new will, naming himself the heir. He framed Miguel Santos, an innocent man, forcing Miguel to take the blame in order to protect his wife Helena and their daughter Rosa. Edward promised he wouldn't touch Helena if Miguel stayed silent, but it was a devil's promise. Cassian felt sick. The empire he'd inherited, the empire he'd killed to protect, the empire he'd believed was the Blackwell legacy, had been built on blood and lies. His grandfather wasn't the founder. His grandfather was a thief, a killer, a traitor. But the worst was still ahead. In a thick file, Cassian found records of the deaths of Emilia's parents. Miguel and Rosa Santos had been murdered on Edward's direct orders when they tried to run from his control. Emilia, only 7 at the time, should have died with them, but somehow the child had survived. Edward ordered a hunt for her, but Helena, who'd been secretly watching her daughter's family for years, found Emilia first and hid her away. Cassian set the file down, his hands shaking violently. Everything was starting to make sense. Why his mother Margaret had always looked at Emilia with guilt in her eyes. Why she'd hired Emilia as a maid even when they didn't need anyone else. She knew. Margaret knew who Emilia was, and she'd tried to protect the girl in the only way she could, by keeping her close, inside this house, where she could be sure no one else would find her and kill her. But Edward had died 10 years ago. Why had Margaret still stayed silent? Cassian flipped to the last page of the file and found the answer. Another letter, this one from Edward to Victoria, his sister, written just before he died. In it, Edward revealed the full truth to Victoria and gave her the task of continuing to protect the family secret. Victoria knew. His sister knew everything, and she'd kept quiet for 10 years, letting Emilia be treated like a slave inside the very house that should have been hers. Cassian surged to his feet, kicked the chair over, and roared with a madness of rage. Everything he'd known about his family, about his grandfather, about his sister, had been a lie. And Emilia, the woman he'd locked away, the woman who haunted him, wasn't just a maid. She was the true owner of this empire. She was the rightful heir to everything he possessed. And he'd made her a prisoner in her own house for 9 years. Cassian stared down at his hands, hands that had killed more people than he could count, and for the first time in his life, he felt disgust for himself. Cassian couldn't stop reading. Even though every page felt like a blade slicing into his soul, he kept turning them, kept searching, as if some invisible force were driving him forward. Inside that thick file, he found a small notebook with a worn leather cover, his grandfather Edward's handwriting packed tight across every page. It was a diary that recorded every crime Edward had committed across his life, as if he wanted to preserve them like trophies. And in it, there was a section devoted entirely to the Santos family. March 12th, 20 years ago. Edward wrote that Miguel Santos had become dangerous. After years of silence, Miguel was beginning to show signs he might speak the truth. He'd secretly contacted a lawyer, trying to gather evidence that Edward had stolen the Valdez Empire. Rosa, Miguel's wife, had also discovered the truth about her own origins, that her real father wasn't Miguel, but Rafael Crane, the man her mother Helena had loved for her entire life. Rosa wanted to find Helena, to reunite with her mother, to restore honor to the Valdez family name. Edward couldn't allow that to happen. Cassian read on, every line like acid eating straight through his heart. Edward had ordered his assassins to break into the Santos home in the middle of the night. Miguel was shot dead in the living room as he tried to protect his wife and child. Rosa was dragged from the bedroom, tortured to force her to reveal where Helena was hiding, but she didn't speak. She died in the arms of the killers, her blood staining the floor red, yet her lips stayed sealed, guarding her mother's secret until her final breath. And Emilia, Cassian felt his hands shaking hard when he reached this part. Emilia was only 7 then, asleep in her small room when the gunfire erupted. She woke, ran into the living room, and saw her father lying motionless in a pool of blood. She screamed for her mother, ran to her parents' bedroom, and saw Rosa being dragged across the floor, blood spilling from a wound in her chest. Her mother saw her, and with the last of her strength, Rosa cried out, "Run, my child. Run and don't come back. Find Helena. She'll protect you." Emilia ran. A 7-year-old child ran out the back door, ran into the night, ran until her little legs couldn't carry her anymore. The assassins chased her, but somehow she escaped. Maybe the darkness hid her. Maybe it was luck. Or maybe, as Edward wrote in his diary with bitter resentment, the hand of fate had shielded that child. But fate wasn't entirely merciful. Emilia escaped Edward's killers only to fall into the hands of a trafficking ring. 3 years. 3 years the child lived in hell, sold and resold like an object, enduring things no child should ever have to endure, until Helena found her. Edward never knew Helena had rescued Amelia. He believed the child had died inside the trafficking network, a convenient ending for a potential threat. He never imagined that Helena, the woman he'd stolen everything from, was still watching in silence, still waiting in silence, still protecting what little remained of her family. Cassian closed the diary, unable to read another word. He sat in the darkness of his office, head bowed, shoulders trembling. Everything he'd known about his grandfather, about his family, about himself, had collapsed into ash. His grandfather wasn't the hero who'd built an empire from nothing the way Cassian had been taught. Edward Blackwell was a murderer, a thief, a man who'd slaughtered an entire family just to keep his crimes buried. And Amelia, the girl he'd imprisoned, the girl who haunted him, the girl he'd refused to set free. She was the victim of his own bloodline. She'd lost her parents because of his grandfather. She'd suffered 3 years of hell because of his grandfather. She'd been a slave in this house for 9 years, in the house that should have belonged to her, in the house built on her family's blood. Cassian rose and walked to the window, staring out at the Manhattan night. He didn't know what to do with this truth. He didn't know how to face Amelia, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep living inside a lie, and someone had to pay for what had happened. The only question was who. Cassian was about to rise and leave his office, but his eyes caught another file lying at the bottom of the metal box. This one was thinner, bound with a black leather cord, and on the cover was a name that made his heart feel like it stopped. Victor, his father's name. With trembling hands, Cassian opened the file and began to read, and if what he'd read before had been knives to the heart, what he read now was a full destructive storm tearing through his soul, leaving nothing behind but ruins. Victor Blackwell didn't die in a car accident the way Cassian had been told for 21 years. Victor died because of his own father, Edward Blackwell. In the file, Edward had recorded everything with the terrifying calm of a man with no conscience left. Victor, his only son, had accidentally discovered the truth about the origins of the Blackwell Empire. It happened the year Cassian was 15, when Victor was cleaning his father's office and stumbled upon a hidden safe, a safe identical to the one Cassian had opened tonight. Victor read everything, about Antonio Valdez, about Helena, about Rafael, about Miguel and Rosa Santos, about the 7-year-old child named Amelia who'd been pushed into hell. And unlike Edward, Victor wasn't a monster. He was a man with a conscience, the only person in the Blackwell family who still had any humanity left. Victor confronted Edward, demanded that his father confess, demanded that he return everything to the Valdez family, demanded that he take responsibility for the lives he'd stolen. He even prepared a complete dossier to send to federal law enforcement, ready for the Blackwell Empire to collapse if that was the price of justice. Edward couldn't allow that. In his diary, he wrote about his son with a cold kind of regret, as if he were speaking about a chess piece that had to be removed from the board. Victor was too weak, too idealistic, too much like his mother. He didn't understand that in this world, the strong survive and the weak get crushed. And because he didn't understand, he had to go. The car accident that night wasn't an accident. Victor's car had been sabotaged, the brakes cut. Edward stood at his office window and watched his son drive away from the mansion for the last time, knowing Victor would never return, and he felt no remorse. In the final line of that section, Edward wrote something that made Cassian want to vomit. Victor was my only failed product, but I still have Cassian. The boy has my instincts, my ruthlessness. He'll be a worthy heir. Cassian hurled the file into the wall and screamed in agony. The sound tore through the office, through the halls, maybe through the entire mansion, but he didn't care. His father, the only man who'd ever truly loved him, the man who'd taught him that real strength lived in protecting the people you love, the man who'd held him every night when he was small and told him that no matter what, his father would always be there. That man had been murdered by his own father for daring to do what was right. Cassian collapsed to the floor, his knees slamming into the marble with a painful crack, but he felt nothing. Physical pain was nothing compared to what was ripping his soul apart. 21 years. 21 years living inside a lie. He'd cried at his grandfather Edward's grave, had sworn to protect his legacy, had killed to keep the empire Edward left behind. And all that time, he never knew he was protecting the legacy of the man who killed his father. He had become the very thing his father despised. Ruthless, cold-blooded, without conscience. Edward had been right. Cassian was Edward's perfect product. a monster raised on lies and hatred. And now that monster was on his knees, crying like an orphan for the second time in his life. "Dad," Cassian whispered into the darkness, his voice splintering like glass. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry I became what you hated most." But no one answered. Victor Blackwell had died 21 years ago, taking his dream of justice into the grave. And Cassian, the son he'd loved, had lived his entire life without ever knowing the truth. While Cassian was sinking into the darkness of the truth about his father, an uninvited guest appeared at the Blackwell mansion. Rico Santos, 65. Miguel Santos's younger brother, the man the world believed had died 20 years ago. He'd lived in the shadows for 2 decades, hiding, waiting, gathering every scrap of evidence of Edward Blackwell's crimes. And now, when he learned his niece was being held inside the enemy's own house, he couldn't wait any longer. Rico broke into the mansion through a secret passage, known only to those who had once worked for the Valdez family, a passage Antonio had built more than half a century earlier. He reached Amelia's room at midnight, when the entire estate was sleeping. Amelia jerked awake at the sound of the window opening, and before she could scream, a warm, steady voice rose in the dark. "Don't be afraid, my girl. I'm Rico Santos. I'm your uncle." Amelia stared as the man stepped out of the shadows, his face darkened by years, his eyes carrying the sorrow of someone who'd lost too much. He wore simple black clothes, an old leather briefcase in his hand, and even though Amelia had never met him, she could see the resemblance to her father Miguel in the old photographs Helena had once shown her. "I'm the one who wrote to Maestro Julian," Rico said as he sat beside her bed. "I've watched you from a distance for years, since Helena rescued you from the traffickers, since you were brought into this mansion as a maid. I wanted to take you away, but Helena said it wasn't time yet. She said you needed to be here, needed to understand your enemy, needed to grow stronger before you faced the truth." "What truth?" Amelia asked, even though inside her the pieces were already beginning to lock together after what Maestro Julian had revealed. Rico opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "The truth that you're the rightful heir to the empire the Blackwell family has been holding," he said, placing the file into Amelia's hands. "This is Antonio Valdez's original will. Your great-grandfather, the real founder of this empire. In the will, Antonio left everything to his daughter Helena, your grandmother. And under inheritance law, when Helena died without leaving a new will, everything passed to the next direct heir. That was your mother, Rosa. And when Rosa died too, the only heir left was you." Amelia Santos Valdez Crane. Amelia looked down at the documents in her hands, feeling as if she were holding a bomb. She was the heir. She was the true owner of everything Cassian Blackwell possessed. This mansion, this empire, all of it should have belonged to her family, should have belonged to her. "And there's more," Rico said, pulling out a USB drive and a stack of photographs. "Proof that Edward Blackwell murdered your great-grandfather, forged the will, ordered the deaths of your parents. It's all here, enough to drag the Blackwells into court, enough to take back everything that's yours, enough to avenge everyone who died." Amelia held the USB, her hands trembling. Revenge. She could destroy the Blackwell family. She could reclaim the empire. She could make Cassian pay for the 9 years she'd been turned into a slave. But another image rose in her mind, sharp and unavoidable. Cassian on the floor of his office, crying like a child as he read about his father's death. She'd seen it through a crack in the door as she passed, before Rico arrived. She'd seen the collapse of the ruthless Mafia king, and in that moment she hadn't seen an enemy. She'd seen another victim of Edward Blackwell, an orphan like her, a soul devoured by lies. "What are you going to do with all of this?" Rico asked. Amelia stayed quiet for a long time, looking toward the window where dawn was beginning to show. "I don't know yet," she whispered, "but I need time to think. Helena taught me that hatred is a chain. I don't want to wear that chain for the rest of my life." Victoria Blackwell wasn't a fool. She noticed the change in Cassian the very next morning after the night he found the hidden safe. His gray eyes weren't icy anymore. They were empty, like the eyes of the dead. He didn't give orders, didn't hold meetings, didn't do any of the things a mafia boss was supposed to do. He only sat in his office and stared into nothing, as if his soul had already left his body. Victoria knew this was her opening. She'd waited her whole life for a moment like this. The moment Cassian was weak. The moment she could take everything that should have been hers. She was Victor Blackwell's daughter, Edward Blackwell's granddaughter. Yet because she'd been born a woman, she'd been pushed aside while Cassian inherited it all. It wasn't fair, and Victoria was going to fix that unfairness. Within 2 days, Victoria secretly reached out to the 3 biggest mafia bosses in the neighboring states, men who'd resented Cassian's rule for years. She promised them rich slices of territory, lucrative arrangements, privileges Cassian had never allowed. In return, they'd back her coup, help her remove Cassian, help her seize the throne of the Blackwell Empire. But Victoria knew outside support wouldn't be enough. She needed a hostage, something that would force Cassian to bend without daring to fight back. And the perfect hostage was Margaret Blackwell, their mother. Margaret was taken on the 3rd night. While she was sitting in her private room reading, Victoria's men clapped a hand over her mouth, bound her, and dragged her to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Manhattan. Victoria called Cassian herself to deliver the news, her voice cool and triumphant. "Dearest brother," she said, "I've got a small gift for you. Mother is with me now, and she'd love to see you. But before you come, I have a few small conditions. You'll sign the papers transferring all power to me. You'll leave New York and never return, and you'll hand that dancing maid over to me so I can deal with her. If you don't agree," Victoria let out a soft laugh, "I'm not sure Mother will be in one piece the next time you see her." Cassian stood in his office with the phone in his hand, his body trembling with rage and helplessness. His sister had betrayed him. His mother was in the enemy's hands. And he, the Mafia king who'd once terrified the entire East Coast, didn't have the strength to fight anymore. His soul had been crushed by the truth about his grandfather, about his father, about himself. He didn't even know who he was anymore. Nathan Cole, Cassian's most loyal right hand, stood beside him, worry etched into his face. "What do you want me to do, sir?" Nathan asked. "We can gather men. Hit the place where Victoria is holding Mrs. Margaret." "No," Cassian shook his head. "Victoria has too many allies now. If we attack head-on, my mother will die." "Then what are you going to do?" Cassian stayed silent for a long moment. Then he said something Nathan never would have expected. "I need to speak with Amelia." Cassian came to Amelia's room at midnight, but this time he didn't open the door with a key like an owner. He knocked and waited. When Amelia opened the door, she saw a Cassian completely different from the man she'd known. No arrogance, no cruelty, no ruler's stare. Only a man who'd lost everything, standing there with his shoulders slumped and his eyes red from sleeplessness and crying. "I know who you are," Cassian said, his voice rough. "I know what my grandfather did to your family. I know this empire should have been yours. And I know you've got every reason in the world to want me dead." Amelia didn't move. She said nothing, only watched him with an unreadable gaze. "But I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," Cassian went on. "I'm here to beg you to save my mother. Victoria kidnapped her. Victoria will kill her if I don't surrender. And I can't let my mother die. She's the only innocent one in this family. She tried to protect you in her own way for all these years. Please, Amelia." Cassian Blackwell sank to his knees in front of her, head bowed low, and Amelia could see his shoulders shaking. "I'll do anything you want. I'll sign the empire over to you. I'll confess to the police about every crime the Blackwell family committed. I'll die if you want me to die. Just help me save my mother. Please." Amelia looked down at the man kneeling at her feet, and she remembered Helena's words. "Real strength isn't in destroying your enemy. It's in having the power to destroy them and choosing not to. Stand up," she said, gentle but firm. "I'll help you, not for you, but for Margaret. And because I don't want another innocent person to die for crimes they didn't commit." The plan came together within a few hours. Rico Santos, with the remnants of underworld connections left from Antonio Valdez's time, provided intelligence on the warehouse where Victoria was holding Margaret. Nathan Cole gathered the men still loyal to Cassian. Not many, only about 20. But every one of them was among the most battle-hardened fighters. And Amelia, though she had no experience in combat, insisted on going with them. She said Margaret had quietly protected her for 9 years, and she owed her at least her presence in a moment of danger. They entered the warehouse at 3 a.m, when the darkness was at its thickest, and the enemy's vigilance was at its lowest. Nathan led a strike team through the front entrance, drawing the attention of Victoria's men. Meanwhile, Cassian, Amelia, and Rico slipped in through the back, where they knew Margaret was being held. Gunfire exploded like fireworks from hell. Sparks flashed in the dark, and cries of pain echoed between cold concrete walls. Cassian guided them through shadowed corridors, his pistol ready to fire, but his mind wasn't cold the way it used to be. Every time he squeezed the trigger, he asked himself whether he was doing what was right, or only feeding the same spiral of violence his grandfather Edward had started. They found Margaret in a small room on the second floor, her hands and feet bound to a chair, her mouth gagged. When she saw Cassian and Amelia step in, her eyes lit with hope, but they were also full of fear. She tried to shake her head, tried to warn them about something, but it was too late. Applause sounded from the corner of the room, and Victoria stepped out of the darkness, her gun aimed straight at Amelia. "How touching," Victoria said, her voice dripping with mockery. "My brother, the infamous mafia boss, begging a maid for help. Grandfather must be twisting in his grave. Put the gun down, Victoria," Cassian said, his voice tight. "This is between me and you. Don't drag other people into it." Victoria laughed, sharp and unhinged. "Don't drag other people into it," she screamed. "You dragged this maid into our lives the night you forced her to dance. You let her enchant you, make you weak, make you lose a Blackwell's instincts, and now you want me to spare her." Victoria kept the gun trained on Amelia, her eyes burning with hatred. "Do you know why I hate you?" she asked Amelia. "Not because you're a maid, because you're a Valdez. I knew 10 years ago, when Grandfather told me, I knew you were a threat to this family. I've wanted to kill you for a long time, but Grandfather said to wait, to keep you here so we could watch you, and I waited. But Grandfather's gone now, and I don't have to wait anymore." Everything that happened next unfolded in only a few seconds, but for Amelia it felt like an entire century. Victoria pulled the trigger. Cassian lunged toward Amelia. The shot cracked. Blood. Amelia felt a crushing weight slam into her, and when she opened her eyes, she saw Cassian sprawled over her, blood spreading across his shirt. He'd taken the bullet for her. "No!" Amelia screamed, catching Cassian. "No, no, no! Why would you do that?" Cassian looked at her, his gray eyes already starting to blur, but a strange smile rested on his mouth, the smile of someone who'd found redemption. "Because it's what my father would do," he whispered. "Protect the one you love." Victoria stared at the scene in shock and fury. She lifted her gun, ready to fire a second shot, but she'd forgotten someone. Nathan Cole. He'd slipped into the room through the back door while Victoria was focused on Amelia and Cassian. Another shot rang out, but this time Victoria went down. The bullet tore through her shoulder, making her drop the gun and collapse. Nathan stepped forward, kicked Victoria's gun out of reach, and snapped cuffs on her wrists. "It's over," he said coldly. "You lost." Amelia didn't hear anything. She focused only on Cassian in her arms, his blood soaking her hands. She ripped fabric from her own clothing and pressed it to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Hold on," she said, her voice shaking. "Don't you die. You're not allowed to die. You still owe me my freedom, remember?" Cassian gave a faint laugh, then coughed up blood. "You're still thinking about freedom?" he asked, his voice weak. "You've been free since the moment you danced that waltz. I was just too blind to see it." "Don't talk," Amelia said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Save your strength. The ambulance will come." Cassian lifted a hand, trembling as he touched her face and wiped away her tears. "Don't cry for me," he whispered. "I don't deserve your tears." Then his eyes fell shut, and Amelia's world felt like it was collapsing. 3 days. 3 days, Cassian lay motionless in a hospital bed, surrounded by the steady beeping of a heart monitor and the harsh sting of disinfectant in the air. The bullet had gone through his right lung, only a few inches from his heart. The doctors said his chance of survival was about 30%, and even if he made it, nobody knew when he'd wake up, or whether he'd wake up at all. Amelia didn't leave the hospital for those 3 days. She sat beside Cassian's bed, watching his face, pale as paper, watching his chest rise and fall weakly beneath the rhythm of the ventilator. She didn't understand why she was here, why she cared what happened to this man. He was the grandson of the man who'd murdered her parents. He'd imprisoned her, turned her into a captive inside her own home. He was the embodiment of everything she should have hated, but he was also the one who'd thrown himself into the line of fire to save her. On the second day, Rico Santos came to see her. He brought the old leather briefcase full of evidence of the Blackwell family's crimes, set it on the table beside the hospital bed, and looked at Amelia with a stern gaze. "It's time, my girl," he said. "Cassian is in a coma. Victoria's been arrested. The Blackwell Empire is in chaos. This is the perfect moment to reveal the truth, to take back everything that belongs to the Valdez family, to avenge your parents, Helena, everyone who died." Amelia looked at the briefcase, then looked down at Cassian lying still. Inside her head, 2 voices argued. One voice urged her to act, reminded her of the years of slavery, the scars on her back, The night she watched her parents get slaughtered. Justice. That was the justice she deserved. But the other voice, Helena's voice, whispered something else. Hatred is a chain, my girl. It doesn't bind your enemy, it binds you. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Forgiveness means freeing yourself from the weight of the past so you can keep walking forward. Amelia stood and went to the window, looking out at the Manhattan sky as it slowly turned toward sunset. She thought of Helena, who'd lost everything and still found happiness in teaching her to dance, in loving her without conditions. She thought of her mother, Rosa, who died with her lips still sealed about Helena's hiding place, who gave up her life to protect the people she loved. She thought of Cassian, of the look in his eyes when he lunged into the bullet's path, of his last words before he slipped into darkness. Because it's what my father would do. Protect the one you love. Victor Blackwell, Cassian's father, had wanted to do the right thing too. He'd wanted to return everything to the Valdez family, wanted to expose Edward's crimes, and he'd died for it. Cassian, even without knowing the truth for 21 years, carried his father's heart inside him. He was a victim of lies, just as she was a victim of violence. I've decided, Uncle, Amelia said, turning back to Rico. I'm not going to release this evidence. Not now. Not like this. Rico stared at his niece, stunned. What are you saying? He demanded. He killed your parents. His family stole everything from us, and you want to forgive them. I'm not forgiving Edward. Amelia shook her head. He's dead, and his crimes will never be erased. But I don't want to punish people who didn't commit those crimes. Margaret is innocent. Cassian didn't know the truth. Even Victoria, as twisted as she is a product of Edward's poisonous upbringing. She stepped back to Cassian's bedside and looked down at his pale face. Helena taught me that the most beautiful dance isn't the dance of destruction. It's the dance of transformation. I want to transform my family's pain into something beautiful, instead of multiplying suffering. Rico was quiet for a long moment. Then he let out a slow sigh. You're so much like Helena, he said, his voice threaded with pride and worry. She would have done the same. They sat together in silence until darkness filled the room. And then, on the third day, while Amelia was half asleep in the chair beside the bed, she felt a faint movement. She opened her eyes and saw Cassian looking at her, his gray eyes dull but open, his cracked lips struggling to form words. You're still here, he whispered, his voice rough as sandpaper. Why didn't you leave when you could? Amelia looked at him, and for the first time since it all began, she smiled. A soft smile, without hatred, without fear. Because I don't want to become what your grandfather turned my family into, she said. I don't want to be a hostage to hatred. And because I believe you can become the man your father wanted you to be. Cassian stared at her, and in his eyes Amelia saw something she'd never seen there before. Hope. You're giving me that chance, he asked. Amelia nodded. But you'll have to prove you deserve it. Not to me. To your father's memory. To my family's memory. To yourself. A year passed like a dream. A year long enough for wounds to heal. Long enough for fractures to be mended. Long enough for the impossible to become possible. And in that 1 year, everything changed. The Helena Valdez Foundation officially launched in the spring, exactly 1 year after the night Cassian took a bullet for Amelia. It became the largest nonprofit in the United States, dedicated to rescuing and supporting children who'd been trafficked. Funded by more than half the wealth of the Blackwell Empire, Cassian kept his promise. He converted the entire underground network into legitimate businesses, worked with federal law enforcement to dismantle the criminal pipelines he'd once run himself, and used every resource he had to rebuild what his grandfather had destroyed. The Helena Valdez Dance Academy opened in the summer, inside the very building where Helena once taught dance before Edward Blackwell ruined her career. It was a free academy for poor children and children who'd been abused, a place where talent mattered more than background, where small feet could learn how to rise from the ashes of fate. Amelia taught there personally every week, passing on to the children what Helena once passed on to her. Maestro Julian Crane, though he was nearly 70, still sat at the grand piano every day, accompanying the children as they practiced, his old eyes shimmering whenever he watched his granddaughter spin across the floor. After so many years of loneliness, he'd found family, and it was the greatest gift of his life. Margaret Blackwell spent the final days of her life in peace in a small house by the sea, far from the glitter and the shadows of the Manhattan mansion. She was forgiven, not because she deserved it, but because Amelia understood that Margaret, in her own way, was also one of Edward's victims. She'd stayed silent for too long, feared too much, and yet she'd tried to protect Amelia in the only way she knew how, by keeping her close. Victoria was sentenced to 20 years in prison for kidnapping and attempted murder. Amelia didn't forgive her, not because she couldn't, but because Victoria felt no remorse. In court, Victoria still looked at Amelia with hatred in her eyes, still believed she was the victim, still refused to accept any responsibility at all. Some people can't be saved, and Amelia had learned how to accept that. And Cassian, he wasn't the East Coast Reaper anymore. He was just a man trying, day by day, to become a better version of himself. He worked 12 hours a day running the foundation and the academy, not because he was chasing redemption, but because for the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. And every evening, he came to the small apartment where Amelia lived, carrying dinner he'd cooked himself, sitting beside her, telling her about his day. They weren't lovers. Not yet. There were too many wounds that still needed healing, too much history that still had to be faced. But they were friends, allies, two souls who'd found each other in the dark and were walking toward the light together. On the Academy's opening night, Amelia stood on stage before hundreds of guests and dozens of children seated in the front row. She wore a simple white dress, her black hair loose over her shoulders, and around her neck hung the silver half-heart pendant Helena had left behind. "My grandmother taught me that dance isn't in the feet," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "It's in the soul, and our souls, no matter how many times life beats them down, can still stand up and dance. Tonight, I want you to know that no matter where you come from, no matter what you've lived through, you deserve to dance, to dream, to live a whole life." The music began, and Maestro Julian played the melody he'd composed for Helena so many years ago. Cassian stepped onto the stage, no longer an arrogant mafia boss, only a man with a heart learning how to love again. He faced Amelia and held out his hand in invitation. "Will you give me this honor?" Amelia smiled and placed her hand in his. They began to dance, a waltz that was gentle and fluid, two souls becoming one on the floor. And somewhere, Amelia believed, Helena was smiling down at them. The waltz continued, and Amelia and Cassian turned across the dance floor like two birds who'd finally found their sky after so many years of captivity. Crystal light poured over them, but this time it wasn't the glare of power or wealth. It was the light of hope, of healing, of something good being born from the ashes of the past. When the melody came to an end, Amelia lifted her gaze and whispered into the dark, "I did it, Grandma. I turned darkness into light." And somewhere beyond time and space, Amelia believed Helena, Rosa, Miguel, and even Victor Blackwell were smiling, because true love never dies. It only transforms into the strength that helps those who remain keep rising and keep dancing through the storms of life. This story teaches us that hatred is a chain that binds the self, not the enemy. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting the wounds. It means freeing the heart from the weight so it can keep moving forward. Real strength isn't in destroying someone else. It's in having the power to destroy and choosing instead to transform pain into something good. And no matter how many times life throws you into the abyss, your soul can still stand up and dance. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the very last moment. How did this story make you feel? Did it make you think of anything in your real life? Have you ever had to face the choice between forgiveness and revenge? Share what you feel, straight from your heart, in the comments below. We truly want to hear your thoughts and your story. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, hit like, and share this video with the people you love so they can listen to meaningful stories every day too. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.